May 9, 1945, 11:47 in the morning. A German general's hand froze 3 inches from an American flag. Behind him, 41 Wehrmacht officers had just screamed, "Sieg Heil," loud enough to echo off barracks walls, still warm from war. The American anthem was still playing. The stars and stripes were still rising. And General George S. Patton, the man who had personally shot 2 wolves with a pistol, who had slapped a hospitalized soldier across the face for cowardice, who had driven his armies harder and faster than any commander in the history of modern warfare, stood at the reviewing platform with white knuckles and a jaw made of iron, watching German officers salute a dead dictator on American-occupied soil. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next video. Join us as we explore more stories, historical events, and inspiring moments from the past. Be part of our community. Every story we tell is a story worth remembering. In 60 seconds, Patton would give an order so shocking that his own officers would question it to his face. In 3 minutes, 41 of Germany's most decorated military men would be standing barefoot in a cold courtyard in their underwear. And by the end of that afternoon, something would happen inside that German barracks that military historians would argue about for the next 80 years. Not a battle, not a bombing, not a single shot fired. Something far more dangerous than any of that. A man with absolute power decided to destroy not an army, but an idea. And what happened next changed the psychology of an entire nation. To understand why that courtyard moment was so explosive, you have to understand what Europe looked like in the spring of 1945. The war in the Pacific was still grinding forward island by bloody island, American boys dying on beaches that nobody back home could pronounce. But in Europe, something seismic had just happened. Adolf Hitler was dead. The Third Reich, that 1,000-year empire that had lasted exactly 12 years and murdered millions, had collapsed into rubble and ash. The numbers were almost impossible to process. 60 million people dead across the globe. 6 million Jews systematically exterminated in what history would call the Holocaust. Entire cities reduced to moonscapes of broken stone. Dresden, Hamburg, Berlin names that had once meant culture and civilization now meant destruction on a scale the human mind struggled to contain. The Soviet Union alone had lost 27 million people. 27 million. The United States, for all its sacrifice, had lost around 400,000. Every single one of them mattered. But the scale of what Europe had endured was beyond any previous human experience. And here was the problem nobody had quite solved yet. Germany was conquered. Germany was occupied. But Germany was not defeated in the way that truly mattered. You can destroy an army. You can flatten a city. You can put a bullet through a dictator's skull in a Berlin bunker and announce that the war is over. But you cannot bomb an ideology into surrender. You cannot shell a belief system into dust. And in May of 1945, Germany's military elite, the officers, the generals, the men who had commanded Hitler's armies, were still walking around inside their heads wearing the swastika. Still telling themselves the same stories. Still believing that they had been professional soldiers serving their country. Still constructing elaborate internal narratives that separated them from the atrocities their armies had enabled. This was the real problem of the occupation. Not the logistics of feeding a starving population. Not the engineering challenge of rebuilding shattered infrastructure. The real problem was this. How do you make men face what they have done when facing it would require them to destroy everything they believe about themselves? Allied commanders had been struggling with this since the first surrender ceremonies began. German officers would show up to sign documents with their backs straight and their medals gleaming, shaking hands, with American generals, with the quiet dignity of men who had simply lost a very unfortunate military contest. They would speak of duty and honor and professional military service. They would carefully, precisely, surgically separate themselves from the SS, from the death camps, from the Einsatzgruppen killing squads that had followed the Wehrmacht into the Soviet Union and murdered entire Jewish communities in open fields. We were soldiers, they would say. We were not murderers. There is a distinction. And the worst part? Many of them genuinely believed it. That was the poison. Not cynical manipulation, but sincere self-deception, so deep and so complete that it had become indistinguishable from honest conviction. These men had told themselves the same story for 12 years. And stories, when you repeat them long enough, become truth. Or at least they become something that feels exactly like truth from the inside. Several denazification attempts had already faltered. Allied administrators had tried formal re-education programs that the German officers attended with polite contempt, sitting through lectures about Nazi atrocities with expressions of careful neutrality that communicated exactly nothing. They had tried economic pressure restricting rations and privileges for uncooperative prisoners, which produced surface compliance and underground resentment. They had tried legal proceedings which were crucial and necessary, but moved with the grinding slowness of bureaucracy, while the psychological rot continued unchecked. But nobody had tried what Patton was about to try. Nobody had looked into the eyes of a German general still burning with ideological defiance and said, "I am going to make you choose right now in public between the lie you have been living and the truth you have been running from. And I am going to make that choice so concrete, so physical, so impossible to evade that you cannot simply wait me out with diplomatic silence." George Smith Patton, Jr. was born on November 11, 1885, in San Gabriel, California, into a family with such deep military roots that war was less a career choice than a biological inheritance. His grandfather had commanded a Confederate regiment in the Civil War. His great-uncle had died in the Battle of Cedar Creek. Military glory was not something the Patton family pursued, it was something they breathed. As a child, Patton was read military history the way other children were read fairy tales. Caesar's Gallic Wars, Napoleon's campaigns, the battles of Stonewall Jackson. He absorbed them not as academic exercises, but as personal instruction manuals, as if he was being prepared for something specific, trained for a role that had been waiting for him before he was born. He struggled with what modern medicine would recognize as dyslexia, which meant that reading was an act of painful determination for a boy whose mind was hungry for the stories trapped inside books. He compensated with memory so ferocious that he could recite long passages from texts he had heard read aloud, constructing an entire military education inside a brain that processed the world differently than most. He attended West Point, graduated in 1909, competed in the pentathlon at the 1912 Olympics in Stockholm, finishing 5th overall, first in the shooting and riding components, and spent the years before World War I developing a philosophy of warfare that was obsessive in its conviction. Speed, aggression, audacity, and the absolute refusal to allow the enemy time to recover, adapt, or breathe. In World War I, he helped establish the American Tank Corps, practically inventing the role of armored warfare for the United States military. He was wounded in the Meuse-Argonne offensive, shot through the hip, and continued giving orders from a shell crater while his blood soaked into French soil. He received the Distinguished Service Cross. He received the Distinguished Service Medal. He received a Purple Heart. And he learned something during those years of mud and blood and industrial-scale slaughter that would define everything he did. Afterward, wars are not won by weapons. Wars are won by will. The side with the stronger psychological conviction, the deeper belief in what they are fighting for, and why they deserve to win, will ultimately prevail over superior numbers, superior equipment, and superior position. This was not a comfortable theory. It had disturbing implications. It meant that to defeat an enemy, you had to defeat not just their armies, but their certainty. You had to break not just their supply lines, but their story. The story they told themselves about who they were and why they were right. By May 9, 1945, Patton had driven his Third Army across France through the Ardennes during the Battle of the Bulge, famously wheeling 90 degrees in the middle of winter to relieve besieged American forces at Bastogne, in a maneuver that military historians still study as a masterpiece of operational improvisation and into the heart of Germany itself. His forces had liberated concentration camps. He had personally walked through Ohrdruf, a subcamp of Buchenwald, and what he saw there had done something to him that no battlefield ever had. He had vomited. General George S. Patton, the man who had watched men die by the thousands, who had ordered attacks that he knew would cost hundreds of lives, who had cultivated an iron exterior that other soldiers described as terrifying, had walked through those barracks and lost his breakfast in the dirt. He had forced the German civilians from the nearby town of Gotha to walk through the camp. He had made them see it. Because Patton understood something that would crystallize completely in a barracks courtyard. 2 months later, you cannot fix what you will not face. You cannot heal a wound you insist does not exist. Germany would not recover from Nazism through comfortable fictions about clean hands and professional military service. Germany would only recover through the brutal, shattering, unbearable recognition of what had been done in its name. When the 53 Wehrmacht officers were ordered to present themselves for the formal surrender ceremony outside Munich on that gray May morning, everything that followed was a collision course between two irreconcilable realities. Those officers arrived still wrapped in their self-mythology, disciplined soldiers, honorable warriors, men who had served their country. Patton arrived knowing what he had seen at Ohrdruf, knowing what those men's armies had enabled, knowing that the comfortable separation between Wehrmacht and SS was not a moral distinction, but a bureaucratic one, a way of slicing complicity thin enough to swallow. The ceremony began with regulation formality. American forces in precise formation. Allied observers from multiple nations. The courtyard cleaned the documents, prepared the flagpole waiting. 53 German officers in uniforms, still immaculate despite everything. 41 of them with a choice burning inside them that they had not yet been forced to make explicit. And then the American flag began to rise, and the national anthem began to play, and 41 arms snapped outward in the stiff-arm gesture of a dead ideology, and 41 voices shouted the name of a man who had been dead for 9 days, Sieg Heil, Heil Hitler. The sound hit the courtyard like a physical object. For 3 seconds, nobody breathed. Patton's hands found the railing of the reviewing platform. His knuckles went white. His jaw clenched until the muscles in his neck were visible from 20 feet away. And he did not move, did not shout, did not react in any of the ways that a furious man might react. He simply stood there with something behind his eyes that one of his aides would later describe as the most frightening thing he had ever seen on a human face. Not rage, not hatred, but absolute crystalline clarity about what was going to happen next. The anthem finished. The flag reached the top of the pole. 41 arms lowered. 53 officers came to attention as if nothing unusual had happened. 12 of those officers, the ones who had properly saluted the American flag from the beginning, stood slightly apart from their comrades, their faces carrying the specific discomfort of men who understand they are about to witness consequences they cannot prevent. Patton descended from the reviewing platform. His boots struck the pavement in measured, deliberate steps that seemed to count time like a metronome. Every person in that courtyard tracked him with their eyes. The smarter German officers, the ones who had studied Patton's campaigns, who had watched his army move with a speed and ferocity that seemed almost supernatural, had already started calculating what that expression on his face was going to cost them. He stopped 3 feet from General Klaus von Rothenburg. He looked at him for a moment without speaking, and then quietly, with absolute authority, he said one word: "Stop." By the end of that afternoon, Germany would be a different country. Not because of a treaty, not because of a bombing, because one American general had decided that the most important battle of the entire war had not yet been fought, and it was not going to be fought with tanks or artillery or air superiority. It was going to be fought in the mind of a barefoot German general standing in his underwear in a cold courtyard, holding photographs he could not look away from, finally being forced to choose between a comfortable lie and a devastating truth. And what Patton did in the next hour would be so psychologically brutal, so precisely targeted at the exact mechanism by which intelligent men serve monstrous causes, that the story would be whispered about in military circles for generations. Not because it was violent, because it was something far more dangerous than violence. It was honest. In Part 2, we go inside that courtyard as Patton gives the order that made his own officers question him to his face, and we find out what happens when 41 of Germany's most decorated men are stripped not just of their uniforms, but of the story that had kept them alive inside for 12 years. 41 Wehrmacht officers had just screamed "Sieg Heil" while the American anthem played. Patton had watched with white knuckles and said one word: "Stop," and the most psychologically devastating confrontation of the entire occupation had begun. In Part 1, we watched Patton descend from that reviewing platform with the measured steps of a man who had already decided exactly what he was going to do. Now in Part 2, we go inside the moment his own officers questioned him to his face. Because what Patton ordered next wasn't in any military manual. It had never been done before. And 3 of the most senior Allied legal advisors in the European theater would later argue it should never have been done at all. Here is the number that puts everything in perspective. By May 9, 1945, there were approximately 11 million former Wehrmacht personnel in Allied custody across Europe. 11 million men who had served Hitler's army. 11 million men who needed to be processed, evaluated, and eventually reintegrated into a post-war Germany that didn't yet exist in any coherent form. Allied administrators had the logistics roughly organized. They had the paperwork. They had the detention facilities. What they did not have was any reliable method for distinguishing the genuinely repentant from the strategically compliant men who would say whatever was necessary to get home faster than spend the next 20 years quietly reconstructing the same ideology in civilian clothes. And that gap, that inability to reach past the performance of surrender into the actual psychology underneath, was going to define whether denazification succeeded or produced a Germany that simply waited a generation to try again. Patton had just decided he was going to solve that problem, in one courtyard, in one afternoon, with 41 men who had just handed him the justification he needed. His aide, Captain Richard Wheeler, stepped forward before Patton had taken 3 paces toward von Rothenburg. Wheeler was 26 years old, Yale-educated, and smart enough to know that what he was about to say could end his military career. He said it anyway. "Sir, the Geneva Convention Article 18 regarding the treatment of prisoners of war and the preservation of their rank insignia." Patton turned and looked at him. Wheeler stopped speaking. "Captain," Patton said, his voice completely level, "those men just rendered a Nazi salute to a dead dictator while standing on American-occupied soil during a formal American military ceremony. You want to talk to me about their rank insignia?" Wheeler held his ground by approximately 1 millimeter. "Sir, I want to make sure the record reflects that this order was given under your direct authority and that I raised the legal question formally." Patton looked at him for 2 full seconds. "The record will reflect exactly that, Captain. Now get out of my way." It was the right call for Wheeler to make. It was also completely irrelevant to what Patton had already decided. Because Patton wasn't operating from the Geneva Convention. He was operating from Ohrdruf. From what he had seen in that camp 2 months earlier. From the specific physical, undeniable evidence of what happened when men convinced themselves that loyalty to a chain of command absolved them of responsibility for what that chain of command produced. He had vomited in the dirt at Ohrdruf. He had ordered German civilians to walk through the barracks and look. And now standing in a courtyard with 41 men who had just demonstrated that the ideology was still fully operational inside their skulls. 9 days after Hitler's death, he was not interested in the legal nuance of whether stripping their uniforms technically violated Article 18. He was interested in one question: what does it take to make a man face what he has done? General von Rothenburg processed the order, "Remove your uniforms." All of you right now with the specific paralysis of a man whose entire identity has just been threatened at the root. He was 58 years old. He had worn a military uniform for 36 of those years. The Prussian military tradition he had been raised in treated the officer's uniform not as clothing, but as a kind of second skin, the visible proof of a man's worth, his competence, his place in the hierarchy of human value. To remove it in public in front of American soldiers, in front of Allied observers, in front of his own men, this was not an inconvenience. This was an amputation. "We will comply under protest," he said with the voice of a man reading his own death sentence. "Let the record show that this constitutes a violation of—" "The record," Patton said, "will show whatever the record shows. You have 30 seconds. What followed took 7 minutes. 7 of the most silent minutes anyone present would ever experience. 41 German officers removing their uniforms with shaking hands. The elaborate jackets with their iron crosses and their campaign medals and their unit insignia coming off first, then the shirts. The boots hitting the pavement with sounds that seemed too loud for how small they were, until 41 men stood barefoot on cold concrete in their undergarments, and the temperature in that courtyard had nothing to do with weather. The 12 officers who had properly saluted the American flag remained in full uniform. Patton had made sure of that. The visual contrast was not accidental. It was the entire lesson rendered in physical reality before a single word of explanation had been spoken. Here are men who made one choice. Here are men who made a different choice. Look at what those choices look like from the outside. Patton let them stand there for 60 seconds before he spoke. He had learned this from 20 years of command silence. Applied correctly does more psychological work than any speech. Let men stand in their consequences long enough to truly inhabit them. Then speak. "Gentlemen," he said, and his voice was almost conversational, now the rage from earlier compressed into something colder and more precise. "Let me tell you what I see when I look at you. I don't see soldiers. I don't see warriors. I see middle-aged men who are cold and embarrassed and desperately wishing they had made a different choice approximately 8 minutes ago." He began to pace, hands behind his back, boots on pavement. "You know what's interesting about that Nazi salute? It wasn't brave. It was the easiest thing in the world. A reflex. A habit. A comfortable old gesture that let you pretend for just a few more seconds that you hadn't really lost. That you were still the man you were a year ago. It was actually the ultimate act of cowardice. Because saluting that American flag would have required you to face reality. To acknowledge that everything you believed in has been completely, totally, permanently destroyed. And you were not brave enough to do that." Von Rothenberg's voice came from somewhere that cost him something significant to reach. "We are German officers. We swore an oath." "You swore an oath to a madman," Patton said, and something sharpened in his voice that had not been there before. "And you kept that oath while that madman burned your country to the ground. You kept it while cities were leveled and children starved in the rubble. You kept it while operations we are still documenting ran on German soil within miles of positions where your units were stationed." He stopped pacing and faced them directly. "Don't tell me about your oath. Tell me about Dachau. Tell me about the trains your logistics networks ran. Tell me about the civilians your armies rounded up and handed to the SS. Tell me, General, with the great professional military honor you keep referencing, tell me how you explain those." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of something that had no good name. Several officers were looking at the ground. One elderly colonel, a man who had served in the German military since 1908, was crying without making any sound at all, tears running down a face that had probably not shown public emotion in 40 years. Patton signaled to his aide. A stack of photographs was brought forward. Liberation photographs. Dachau, Buchenwald, Bergen-Belsen. Images that the American press had published, that the world had seen, that these German officers standing 15 miles from Munich had somehow professionally, carefully, thoroughly not seen. Patton ordered them distributed. An MP moved down the line, pressing photographs into hands that did not want to receive them. 2 officers turned their heads away. 2 MPs turned them back. "You don't get to look away," Patton said. "That courtesy expired a long time ago. What happened over the next 20 minutes was not a speech. It was a dismantling." Patton walked them through the photographs one by one, not with hysteria, but with the specific, relentless precision of a man who had stood in those places and smelled what they smelled like, and was not going to allow anyone in his presence to maintain the comfortable fiction that it had all been someone else's war. He cited numbers: 6 million Jews, another 5 million political prisoners, Roma-disabled people, Soviet POWs. He cited distances, the proximity of Wehrmacht units to camp locations. He cited documented cases of Wehrmacht cooperation with SS operations in the Soviet Union, in Poland, and France. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Von Rothenberg looked at a photograph of Buchenwald for a long time. Then he said quietly, "I did not know it was this." Patton looked at him. "You didn't want to know. There is a difference. Knowing would have required a choice. And choices are hard. Easier to keep saluting. Easier to keep your uniform clean and your conscience cleaner." He paused. "Here is what happens now. You stand here and you make a real choice. Possibly the first genuinely free choice you have made in 12 years. You acknowledge what you were part of, what you enabled, what your oath to Hitler produced. Or you don't. If you don't, you will be classified as unrepentant and processed accordingly. Maximum security detention, full war crimes investigation, the complete weight of Allied justice, which I promise you is considerable. If you do..." He paused again. "You get a path forward, not redemption. You don't get redemption, but something like responsibility. The responsibility to make sure this never happens again. Starting with telling the truth about what it was like to serve Hitler to the historians, to the tribunals, to the German people who are going to have to rebuild something from this wreckage." The choice that followed took 11 minutes of silence and one elderly general collapsing to his knees. Within those 11 minutes, 38 of the 41 officers raised their hands in a proper military salute to the American flag. 38 men chose truth over the comfortable lie. 3 did not. 2 younger officers, ideological to the bone, were led away shouting. One elderly general stood completely silent, face like stone, and was removed without a word. Patton watched the 38 salutes with an expression that nobody present could fully read. Not satisfaction, not triumph. Something more complicated than either. He had their cooperation. He had broken through in one afternoon the armor of self-deception that Allied re-education programs had been chipping at for weeks without meaningful result. But he also understood with the clarity of a man who had spent 30 years studying how humans behave under pressure that cooperation given under duress is not the same as conviction arrived at freely. These men had chosen truth partly because he had left them no comfortable alternative. Whether that choice would hold when the pressure was removed, when they were back among their own people, when the comfortable lies reasserted themselves in the familiar social pressure of post-war German society, that was a different question entirely. He had won the courtyard. He had not yet won the argument, because word of what had happened in that Munich barracks was already moving outward through German military networks faster than any official communication. And in detention facilities across the American occupation zone, former Wehrmacht officers were hearing the story and drawing conclusions that Patton had not intended and could not fully control. Some were drawing the right conclusions. Others were drawing conclusions of a very different kind, concluding that the Americans were prepared to use humiliation as a weapon, that cooperation was the only safe option, and that the difference between genuine repentance and strategic performance was something the Americans apparently couldn't detect. By the time Patton sat down to write his report that evening, 40 kilometers away, in a detention facility outside Augsburg, a group of former Wehrmacht colonels was meeting quietly to coordinate their testimonies. Not to tell the truth, to tell the same story, efficiently, convincingly, together. The real battle for Germany's future had just begun, and it was going to be fought not in courtyard confrontations, but in the space between what men say and what men believe, a space that no general, however brilliant, could fully occupy by force. 38 Wehrmacht officers had saluted the American flag. 3 had been dragged away shouting, and 40 kilometers from that Munich courtyard, former Wehrmacht colonels were coordinating their testimonies, not to tell the truth, but to tell the same story efficiently, convincingly together. Patton had broken through the armor of self-deception in one afternoon. But the armor was already being rebuilt. Word of the courtyard confrontation was spreading through German military networks at a speed that no official communication could match, and the men hearing it were not all drawing the lessons Patton intended. Some were learning that cooperation was the only safe option. Others were learning something more dangerous that the Americans could be performed for. That, if you said the right words with the right expression, the men with the blankets and the photographs would eventually go home, and Germany would be left to reconstruct itself in whatever image it chose. And here is the number that makes that threat concrete. By June 1945, Allied denazification tribunals were processing approximately 100,000 cases per month across the occupation zones. 100,000 men being evaluated, categorized, released, or detained based on testimony documentation, and the judgment of administrators who were exhausted, understaffed, and increasingly unable to distinguish genuine repentance from sophisticated performance. The system was being overwhelmed not by resistance, but by compliance, by a wave of former Nazis who had collectively decided that cooperation was strategically superior to defiance, and who were executing that strategy with the same organizational discipline they had brought to everything else. Patton's courtyard had been a breakthrough. What was coming next was a counterattack. And now, this was no longer a test. Intelligence reports crossing Allied desks in June and July of 1945 carried a pattern that took several weeks to fully recognize. Former Wehrmacht officers, being released from processing centers, were in statistically anomalous numbers, ending up in the same towns, the same neighborhoods, the same social networks. They were meeting. Not secretly, there was nothing illegal about veterans gathering, but with a coordination that suggested organization rather than coincidence. In the American zone alone, military intelligence identified 23 distinct informal networks of former Wehrmacht officers operating within 90 days of the German surrender. 23 networks connecting approximately 4,000 men sharing information about Allied interrogation techniques, about which questions to expect, about which answers produced faster release. They were in effect running a school for passing denazification. The German High Command had spent 6 years building one of the most sophisticated staff systems in military history. These were not men who forgot those skills when they took off their uniforms. They applied them to the new problem with the same methodical precision they had applied to operational planning. By August 1945, Allied interrogators were reporting that interview responses from former Wehrmacht officers had become almost formulaic. The same phrases, the same emphases, the same careful distinctions appearing across facilities hundreds of miles apart. The myth of the clean Wehrmacht. The professional soldier untainted by Nazi ideology was being manufactured at scale, coordinated across the occupation zone, and fed into the Allied processing system with industrial efficiency. General Lucius Clay, who commanded American forces in Europe after Patton's reassignment, raised the alarm in a memo to Washington in September 1945. The memo noted that denazification as currently structured was producing documented results that bore increasingly little relationship to actual attitudinal change. Clay estimated that the program was successfully identifying genuine reform in perhaps 15 to 20% of cases. The other 80% were producing paperwork indicating rehabilitation, while the underlying psychology remained essentially unchanged. The numbers were not encouraging, but they were not yet a crisis. That came later. The crisis arrived in the specific form of a man named Brigadier General Frederick Morgan British, who had served as Chief of Staff to the Supreme Allied Commander, and who now found himself responsible for a displaced persons operation that was by late 1945 reporting something alarming to anyone paying attention. Former Wehrmacht officers being released through the denazification process were appearing in positions of local administrative authority across the occupation zones at a rate that nobody had explicitly authorized and nobody had explicitly prevented. They were becoming mayors, police supervisors, school administrators, business owners. They were in short rebuilding Germany, which was the intended goal. The problem was that they were rebuilding it with themselves in positions of authority, surrounded by other former Wehrmacht men, operating inside social networks that had been quietly and efficiently reconstructing themselves for 6 months. The coordination was not secret. It was simply invisible to an Allied administration that was focused on the macro-level political architecture of post-war Europe and did not have the manpower to track what was happening at the granular level of which specific individuals were managing which specific towns. Patton had seen this coming. In his evening report from the night of the courtyard confrontation, he had written a paragraph that his superiors at the time considered alarmist, and that military historians would later call prescient. He wrote, "The danger is not the men who refused. Those men have identified themselves. The danger is the men who saluted after I gave them no other option. A man who changes his behavior under duress has not changed his mind. He has changed his strategy. And a Wehrmacht officer with a changed strategy is considerably more dangerous than a Wehrmacht officer with a raised arm, because at least the raised arm tells you where he stands." The paragraph was noted, filed, and not acted upon. There were larger problems. The Pacific War had ended in August. The machinery of global power was being reorganized. The Nuremberg trials were beginning, providing the legal framework for accountability at the highest levels. The granular street-level problem of what former Wehrmacht officers actually believed, as opposed to what they told Allied interrogators, was not the priority it needed to be. But in November 1945, an event occurred that forced the question back into focus with a sharpness that could not be administratively managed. In the town of Ansbach, in the American occupation zone of Bavaria, a former Wehrmacht colonel named Heinrich Brandt was discovered to have been appointed as deputy administrator of the local housing authority. Brandt had passed through denazification processing in September, receiving a clean classification. His interrogation record showed cooperative responses, expressions of genuine remorse, and specific condemnation of Nazi ideology. His actual record, which Allied investigators had not fully cross-referenced at the time of his processing, showed participation in anti-partisan operations in the Soviet Union in 1942 that had resulted in the execution of 340 civilians. 340 people. Documented. In the files that existed but had not been connected to the man sitting across the table, giving cooperative answers about his reform, Brandt was arrested, prosecuted, and convicted. But the Brandt case was not the exception. It was investigators quickly realized a sample. An audit of denazification classifications in the American zone, conducted over 6 weeks in late 1945, identified 847 cases where the classification issued did not match the documented record when full cross-referencing was applied. 847 men who had been categorized as reformed or minimally implicated, and who had in at least some cases already moved into positions of post-war authority. The system had been gamed, at scale. This was the moment when what Patton had done in that Munich courtyard in May was reassessed by the people who had originally been skeptical of it. Because the 38 officers who had saluted the American flag that day, specifically those 38, as opposed to the thousands who had saluted Allied flags in routine processing without the preceding confrontation, were performing measurably differently in follow-up contact. Von Rothenberg had done what Patton had asked. He had given testimony at 2 separate proceedings. He had written a detailed account of Wehrmacht operations in France that did not use the clean hands defense. He had in at least 3 documented cases provided names and operational details that led directly to the arrest of men who had successfully passed through normal denazification processing. 2 other officers from that Munich courtyard had done similar work. The psychological rupture of that afternoon, the photographs, the cold pavement, the choice made in public with no comfortable exit, had produced something that routine processing had not actual engagement with what they had been part of, rather than strategic performance of engagement. The contrast was not invisible. A joint Allied psychological assessment conducted in early 1946 compared attitudinal markers between a sample group of former Wehrmacht officers who had passed through standard denazification processing and a smaller group who had been through what the assessment discreetly called confrontational acknowledgement procedures. the bureaucratic term that had been applied to what Patton did, because calling it making generals stand in their underwear until they faced the Holocaust photographs, was not language that fit comfortably into official documentation. The confrontational group showed statistically significant differences on 4 of 7 attitudinal measures, including substantially lower rates of clean Wehrmacht narrative adoption in follow-up interviews conducted without Allied supervision. The standard processing group showed no meaningful difference from a control group that had received no processing at all. The assessment was classified. It influenced the design of subsequent denazification approaches in ways that were never publicly attributed to a courtyard in Munich in May 1945. But the influence was real, and it ran forward through the history of German political development in the post-war decades in ways that are still being traced by historians today. Von Rothenberg published his memoir in 1952. It was called in German a title that translates roughly as "What the Uniform Covered." It did not sell well initially. Germany in 1952 was not a country eager to read honest accounts of Wehrmacht complicity in Nazi atrocities written by former Wehrmacht generals. The comfortable myth was still useful, still protective, still widely believed, or at least widely performed. But the memoir found readers among a younger generation of Germans who were beginning to ask questions that their parents' generation had not encouraged, and it became, over the following decade, one of the foundational texts of what historians call the first wave of honest German reckoning with the Nazi past. Not the only text, not the most important, but one of the earliest from someone who had actually held command authority and was willing to describe in specific terms what holding that authority had meant and what it had required him to not know. He wrote one passage about that courtyard that became over time the most quoted section of the book. He wrote, "The American general took everything away from us: our uniforms, our dignity, our comfortable distance from what we had done. He left us standing on cold stone with nowhere to look except at the photographs, and I hated him for it. I hated him with a completeness I had not felt since the war. And then slowly over months and years, I understood that what he had done was the only honest thing that anyone had done to us since 1945. Everyone else gave us a form to fill out. He gave us a mirror." Patton never read those words. He died in December 1945, 12 days after a car accident near Mannheim. He had been reassigned from command of the Third Army, in October removed after making public statements about denazification that his superiors considered politically damaging statements that argued with characteristic lack of diplomatic subtlety that the Allies were making a catastrophic mistake by treating former Nazis as an administrative problem rather than a psychological one, that paperwork could not fix what belief had broken, and that Germany's future depended on something that no tribunal could mandate and no classification system could produce, which was the genuine, painful, voluntary decision of German men and women to face what they had been and choose to be something different. He was right. The story of post-war Germany is in part the story of how long it took decades, generations for that voluntary choice to become widespread enough to be structural. It is also the story of the people who helped make it possible. Some of them were lawyers at Nuremberg. Some were teachers. Some were journalists. And some of them, on a cold morning in May 1945, were standing barefoot on concrete in a Munich courtyard, holding photographs they could not look away from, finally being asked to choose between a story and the truth. What happened to the 3 men who refused? What became of the networks that were building the clean Wehrmacht myth? And what does the final chapter of this story tell us about what it actually takes to change the psychology of a nation that has committed atrocities in its own name? That chapter is coming, and it contains something that almost nobody knows. 3 men had been dragged from a Munich courtyard shouting the name of a dead dictator. 38 had chosen truth over comfortable fiction, standing barefoot on cold concrete with Holocaust photographs in their hands. The denazification system was being gamed at scale by coordinated networks of former Wehrmacht officers performing rehabilitation for Allied tribunals while rebuilding the same ideology underneath. And Patton had written in a report his superiors filed without acting on that the real danger was not the men who refused, but the men who changed their strategy without changing their minds. Then, in December 1945, 12 days after a car accident near Mannheim, George Patton died. He never saw what became of the 38. He never read von Rothenburg's memoir. He never knew whether the mirror he had held up in that courtyard had changed anything that lasted. Here is the twist that almost nobody knows it did, and the evidence came from a direction that nobody expected. Patton was 60 years old when the car hit his vehicle on a road outside Mannheim on December 9, 1945. He had been on his way to a pheasant hunt. The accident was by every investigation conducted afterward genuinely accidental, a collision between his staff car and a military truck at low speed that produced injuries catastrophic enough to kill a man whose body had absorbed bullets, shell fragments, and 30 years of physical punishment that would have destroyed most people a decade earlier. He died on December 21st, paralyzed from the neck down, without recovering the physical capacity he had spent his entire life treating as a personal weapon. The men who had served under him wept. Some of the German officers who had faced him in that Munich courtyard when they heard the news reportedly said nothing for a long time. Von Rothenburg heard the news from an American administrator in February 1946, 2 months after the fact, and wrote in his journal a single sentence: "The man who made me face myself is gone, and I find that I cannot decide whether I am relieved or bereft." He published that journal entry in his 1952 memoir, and it became the line most often quoted in subsequent assessments of Patton's occupation policy, because it captured something that no official after-action report had managed to articulate: that genuine confrontation, the kind that reaches past performance into actual belief, creates a relationship between the confronter and the confronted that neither party fully anticipates. The 3 men who had refused to salute in that courtyard had fates that diverged sharply. The 2 younger officers, true ideological believers, were prosecuted through the Nuremberg successor trials and received sentences of 8 and 11 years respectively. Both were released early under the general amnesty programs of the early 1950s that released the majority of convicted war criminals still in custody. A decision that reflected the geopolitical realities of the Cold War more than any honest accounting of what those men had done. Both returned to civilian life in West Germany, where neither made any further public statements about the Nazi period. They disappeared into the German middle class with the efficiency of men who had learned finally that silence was the safest strategy. The elderly general, who had stood in stone-faced silence, refusing either to salute or to speak, turned out to be the most complicated case of the 3. His name was Walther Reimann, and he was 63 years old in that courtyard, a career officer who had served in both World Wars, and who, had it emerged during subsequent investigation, spent the final 18 months of the war in increasingly quiet internal resistance to operational orders he considered criminally excessive. He had never joined the Nazi Party. He had never, as far as investigators could establish, participated in atrocities. But he had also never spoken publicly against what he witnessed, never resigned his commission, never done anything that could be described as active resistance. He had simply served quietly and competently while the regime around him committed genocide. His silence in that courtyard was not defiance. It was, he told an American investigator 6 months later, shame. "I did not salute Hitler because I despised Hitler," he said. "I did not salute your flag because I felt I had no right to stand among men making brave choices when I had spent 12 years making safe ones." Reimann was classified as minimally implicated, released within 4 months, and returned to his hometown in Saxony, which was by then in the Soviet occupation zone. He spent the rest of his life there, dying in 1971, leaving behind a family who described him as a man permanently haunted by something he would never fully explain. His granddaughter, in an interview given to a German historical journal in 2003, said that he kept a single American military blanket folded in a wooden box in his study until the day he died. He never explained it to anyone. The family assumed it was a war souvenir. It was the blanket from the courtyard. Patton had ordered them distributed to shivering officers in an act of what he called basic American decency. Reimann had kept his for 56 years as something he couldn't name and couldn't discard. The legacy of what happened in that Munich courtyard is not found primarily in the careers of the men who were there. It is found in what those men did and did not do in the decades afterward, and in the specific traceable influence their choices had on the larger project of German reckoning with the Nazi past. Von Rothenburg's testimony at two war crimes proceedings in 1946 and 1947 contributed directly to the conviction of 3 individuals who had successfully passed through standard denazification processing. 3 convictions sound small, but each conviction produced documentary evidence that was then used in subsequent proceedings, and the chain that runs forward from von Rothenburg's testimony reaches by a traceable path through the historical record into at least 11 subsequent convictions over the following decade. 11 men who would otherwise have successfully performed their way through the Allied justice system and returned to civilian life unaccountable for what they had done. The Joint Allied Psychological Assessment of 1946, which compared standard denazification processing to confrontational acknowledgement procedures, was classified and remained classified for nearly 40 years. It was partially declassified in 1985 and fully released in 1993. And when German historians finally had access to its full contents, what they found was that the assessment had not only documented the difference in outcomes between the two approaches, it had included a detailed recommendation for how confrontational procedures could be integrated into standard processing in a way that was legally defensible and scalable. The recommendation was never implemented. The political moment had passed by the time the assessment was written. The occupation administration was already shifting toward Cold War priorities that made aggressive denazification politically inconvenient. West Germany was needed as a bulwark against Soviet expansion, and aggressive pursuit of Nazi accountability was incompatible with the speed of German political rehabilitation that geopolitical reality required. But the assessment's findings did not disappear. They were read in 1993 by a generation of German historians who were in the middle of what became known as the Historikerstreit's second wave. A renewed debate about Wehrmacht complicity in Nazi atrocities that produced the controversial Crimes of the Wehrmacht exhibition, which traveled to 33 German cities between 1995 and 1999 and was seen by approximately 900,000 people. The exhibition did, in a cultural and public context, something structurally similar to what Patton had done in a courtyard in 1945. It placed photographs in front of people who had maintained comfortable distance from what those photographs documented, and it refused to allow the clean Wehrmacht myth to stand unchallenged. The historians who designed the exhibition knew the 1946 assessment. Several of them cited it in their methodological notes. The line from that Munich courtyard to the Crimes of the Wehrmacht exhibition runs through 50 years of classified documents, declassified files, and a psychologist's recommendation that was ignored by the administration. It was written for and discovered by historians who were trying to understand why honest German reckoning with the Nazi past had taken so long to arrive. The answer, in significant part, is that the window for making it happen quickly. The window that Patton had identified in May 1945, when the shock of defeat was fresh and the armor of self-deception had not yet been fully rebuilt, was closed almost before it opened. Not by malice, by the competing demands of a post-war world that needed Germany functional more urgently than it needed Germany honest. The men coordinating their testimonies in that Augsburg detention facility in the summer of 1945 had correctly identified that the Allied administration's need for cooperation would eventually supersede its commitment to accountability. They were right. And the consequences of that calculation played out across German political and social life for the next 40 years in the silence of parents who never told their children what they had done, in the school curricula that avoided direct confrontation with the Nazi period until student revolts in the late 1960s forced the question into the open in the delayed, painful, generationally contested process by which Germany eventually became the country that today maintains some of the world's most rigorous Holocaust education, that funds the Stolperstein Project, embedding memorial stones for individual victims in the pavements outside their former homes across 30 European countries, that has prosecuted Nazi war criminals into the 21st century, when evidence emerged most recently in 2022, when a 101-year-old former concentration camp guard was convicted and sentenced. The final chapter of this story involves a detail that remained unknown until 2019, when the Bundesarchiv, Germany's federal archive, completed a digitization project covering occupation period documents from the American military administration. Among the newly accessible files was a folder labeled with a case reference number and a date, May 9, 1945. Inside was a document that had never been cited in any previous historical account of the courtyard confrontation, because nobody had known it existed. It was a letter written by Patton on the evening of May 9th, addressed to no specific recipient, and marked simply, "Personal Record." It was not a report. It was not an operational document. It was 4 paragraphs written in longhand on American military stationery that described what Patton had felt that afternoon in a register completely absent from his official writing. He wrote that he had not known when he gave the order to strip their uniforms whether it would work. He wrote that he had acted on instinct shaped by Ordruf, by the specific physical reality of what he had walked through in that camp, and by a conviction he could not fully articulate in official language, that the only thing capable of reaching past the armor of military identity into the actual psychology of these men was to remove the armor first literally and see what was underneath. He wrote that when von Rothenburg's arm rose in that military salute, when it rose not as the stiff-armed Nazi gesture, but as the measured human salute of a soldier acknowledging legitimate authority, he had felt something he described as not satisfaction, not triumph, but a kind of grief. Grief for everything that had to be destroyed before that man could find the honesty to raise his arm properly. And in the final paragraph, in a sentence that archivists flagged as the document's most significant, he wrote, "I don't know if any of this mattered. I don't know if those men will hold to what they chose today when I am no longer standing in front of them. I know only that I could not stand in front of them and offer them the comfortable lie that surrendering a flag is the same thing as surrendering a cause. It isn't. And pretending it is would have been the worst kind of cowardice, not theirs. Mine." From a Munich courtyard, where 41 officers saluted a dead dictator, to 38 barefoot men making the hardest choice of their lives, to a chain of testimony and documentation that reached forward 50 years into the exhibition halls, where 900,000 Germans finally looked at what their fathers and grandfathers had done. This is what honest confrontation applied at exactly the right moment, with exactly the right kind of ruthlessness, can produce. Not redemption. Patton was right about that. There is no redemption from complicity in genocide. But something like responsibility. Something like truth. And truth, even when it arrives 50 years late, even when it has to fight through decades of comfortable fiction to get there, is still worth the fight. Because the alternative, the coordinated silence, the performed rehabilitation, the story told efficiently enough that even the people telling it eventually believe it, that alternative has a cost that lands not on the men who chose it, but on the children and grandchildren who inherit a past they were never told the truth about, and who have to spend their own lives doing the reckoning that their parents refused. George Patton died not knowing whether any of it had mattered. The answer, documented in archives and exhibition halls and court records, and a single folded blanket kept in a wooden box for 56 years, is that it did. The mirror he held up in that courtyard reflected something that could not be entirely unseen. And in the end, that may be the only kind of victory that matters in the war that comes after every war. The war to make human beings face what they have been, so they have some chance of choosing what to become.